Good morning and welcome to another fantastic webinar from Sentis. This one is on the missing control, psychological safety in high-risk work. I actually ran this particular session at a conference, at the RIN conference, just a couple of months ago, the Resource Industry Network, which is a fantastic opportunity to get together with other people in the resource industry. So it's a great pleasure to bring this one to you folks online today. And I want to be a little bit provocative with this and ask you a question, have a bit of a play with it really. I want to ask you, if we treated psychological safety as seriously as we do any other critical control, what would we do differently in how we lead, in how we manage risk, and how we respond to warning signs? So we'll come back to that question right at the end. So put that aside for the moment, but we will come back to that. Before we get into this discussion today, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. In fact, I'm coming to you from the beautiful Bunurong lands down here in the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. One of my favourite passions is to get out walking in nature and doing some amateur photography. And that's when I often feel connected to our First Peoples of this land and really value and appreciate how they've looked after this land for hundreds, in fact, thousands and thousands of years before us. So I would just like to acknowledge that we value the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' history, culture, and knowledge. And for those of you that aren't aware of Sentis, this is our mission really. We aim to be a great place to work, and we do put a lot of effort and attention into our people and our culture. We strive to support great work with some of the conservation efforts that we're involved in, and we aim to do great work by partnering with many fantastic organisations that we work with. Our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. And we've actually been around for over 20 years now. I've been on this journey with Sentis for over 8 years, and I've had the pleasure of working with many of these organisations you see on the screen. So we have a fantastic and rich history in this area. So today we're going to be talking about the cost of silence. And I'm going to start by telling you a bit of a story and taking you on a journey. Now, you may well know this story very well. I think it's a fantastic way, though, to bring to the fore exactly what the cost of silence can be for an organisation, and even having a ripple effect outside of that organisation. And this story, of course, is the Boeing story. So if you cast your mind back to 2018, you might remember that there was a Lion Air Flight 610 that crashed. And it was actually took off from Jakarta, and not 15 minutes into its flight, it suddenly nosedived and crashed into the water, into the sea. And 189 lives were lost that day. This was a tragic event, and it rippled around the world. Everyone was shocked and devastated at this crash. And pretty immediately, Boeing jumped in to imply that the crash was due to human error. But then not 5 months after that, in early 2019, another incident occurred. So this time it was Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. It was about, I think, 6 minutes into its ascent, and then same thing, it nosedived and hit the earth, and 157 lives were lost. So within not even 6 months, some 350 odd lives were lost in these crashes. It was absolutely devastating. But very quickly, attention turned to the similarities. You see, both of these aircraft were the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. And initial investigations had started to discover that both showed the same signs of malfunction relating to the MCAS system. That's the Maneuvering Augmentation System, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. So I'm going to unpack for you what we started to unveil from the investigations that were carried out. We very quickly were able to see that there was actually a culture of speed over safety. And it all starts with the fact that Boeing scrapped plans for a new aircraft in order to beat Airbus to market. Now, Boeing and Airbus have been in fierce competition for many, many years. And in fact, the Boeing 737, the actual body of that aircraft, that has been in operation for decades, before we put a man on the moon, actually. That's how old that 737 body aircraft is. It's had many iterations of different engines and things like that over time, but the way it's flown and its flight system has pretty much stayed consistent. Now, Airbus came to market with their A320neo. This was a lot younger than the previous 737 type, and so they had a bit of a competitive advantage. And so Boeing were actually wanting to redevelop an entirely new aircraft that they could put to market, one that would be much more fuel efficient, cost efficient, something that would really blow Airbus out of the market. However, it just so happened that American Airlines had a large contract that they were putting up for grabs. They wanted to order some 200 odd aircraft. And so Boeing really wanted to be in it to win it. And they wanted to get that contract over Airbus. And so what they decided is, instead of, it wasn't really feasible to develop a whole new plane at that point in time, because it would take months and months to get through all of the prototyping and the testing and, all of the hoops that you have to jump for FAA to actually get that aircraft to market. And so what they decided was to stick with the 737 aircraft type, but just to give it some upgrading. So give it a new, bigger and more efficient sort of engine. And so in order to get around a few challenges, they decided to fit these new engines onto that same aircraft. However, these engines are quite large. The 737 aircraft is very low, sitting to the ground. So the body sits quite low to the ground. So these larger engines wouldn't actually fit where they were originally. They had to shift the engines a little forward and higher up on the wing. And that means that there's actually it changes the balance and the weighting of the plane just slightly. They did have concerns that this would change the feel and the operation for the pilots. And so this is why they added the MCAS system. Quite ironically, the MCAS system is a safety system. What it's designed to do is it has a little sensor, and basically it's a bit of IT program. And what it's designed to do is it detects the angle of attack. So that is how steeply the aircraft is rising through the air. If an aircraft rises too steeply, if the angle of attack is too steep, the engines can cut out and stop, and that's obviously a very dangerous situation. And so the MCAS system is designed, has one little sensor on the front of the plane, which detects the angle of attack. If the angle of attack is too steep, it forces the plane's nose to dive a little, so that it stops the risk of those engines stalling. The problem that they found with this MCAS system is that this one single sensor was faulty. And so it was incorrectly deeming that the angle of attack is too steep, and it would force the nose down. Now, this didn't just happen once, though. When they uncovered the black box from that Ethiopian Airlines plane, they found that this was happening over and over and over and over. And so this sensor kept detecting incorrectly that the angle of attack was too steep, and the nose was being forced down, 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 down. And the log shows that these pilots were fighting against this system to try to wrestle back control and stop this from happening, but they couldn't. In fact, You know, when this sensor goes off, those pilots had 15 seconds to override that system. In order for this not to happen and for them to regain that control, they would have had to manually override the MCAS system and in a 15-second window, which is really not a lot of time to diagnose that problem and, you know, override it, put things into place so that you can regain control of the plane. But potentially that would have been possible, right? The thing is, Boeing had not told the pilots that the MCAS system had been added. So the pilots hadn't been told, they were not trained, and it was not even in the aircraft manual. Now you're probably thinking, why on earth would they have not passed that on? Why was it sort of, you know, kept a secret? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the airlines themselves had actually put pressure on Boeing to keep the operation of the plane the same so that the pilots who are already trained in operating those aircraft could basically just jump in and you know, fly these new 737 MAX planes. You see, simulator training, if they change the way that the plane is operated, they need to put all the pilots through simulator training. Now that takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And so there was some pressure on them to keep everything the same so they don't have to put all of the pilots through simulator training. And so this was a bit of a financially driven decision. They didn't pass on that the MCAS system was added so that they could fast track the approval to get these to market and so they could avoid the requirement for simulator training. Now, there were lots of people internally, as I'm sure you can well imagine, who were raising concerns. So, and in fact, I'll show you some of the data in a moment, some of the commentary and feedback. People, you know, the engineers, the mechanics, the people working on the planes and actually building those planes, they were aware that there were shortcuts being taken and that there was you know, some dodginess with the way these were being rushed to market. But unfortunately, either their supervisors and managers weren't empowered to push that up the line, or they were just shut down. And so, you know, after that very first crash, all of those 737 MAX planes should have been taken out of flight. They should have been grounded and taken out of the air. But unfortunately, Boeing didn't do that immediately. In fact, they doubled down on their brand protection and this narrative that it's pilot error. Now, as the investigations unfolded, we really got to see just how, you know, terrible this culture had become. And we could see in comments like this. So I'll read this for you. I don't know how to fix these things. It's systemic, it's culture. It's the fact that we have a senior leadership team that understand very little about the business and yet are driving us to certain objectives. That was said by an employee dated June 2018, so before the first crash. The investigators have talked to journalists over the time, and they, journalists have spoken to people who used to work for Boeing, retired engineers and that sort of thing. And we find a very similar message here. This person has said, the downside is someone can threaten your position at work. You play the ball or else. The managers could tell you to keep your mouth shut or you'll lose your job. And another retired Boeing scientist has said, it's not just that your salary at stake, it's the assignments. You get reassigned to another thing. You can be replaced by someone who's less capable of resisting pressure. Now that's pretty disastrous, if you ask me. So, you know, what happens when speaking up isn't safe? And I'd really be interested in your commentary in the chat on this. I'm actually just keeping my eye on the chat as well as we go through. I'm seeing some fantastic, vast places people are calling in from, so that's wonderful. So what happens, what have you seen happen when speaking up isn't safe? We know that, you know, the MCAS flaw wasn't a secret to anyone inside of Boeing, but there was a real culture that discouraged those employees from voicing their concerns. And so what we tend to see is that there's a pressure to perform, and that causes silences. So people are not speaking up about their concerns. They feel it's not safe to, right? If I could lose my job or be put in another department where, you know, it's kind of a not the job I want to be in, I feel very unsafe. So I'm not going to rattle the cage. So warning signs are missed, not because they're not known, but because they aren't surfaced. And we miss the opportunity to create true safety based on strong systems supported by a positive culture of openness, candor, and leadership that invites challenge. I can see that we've got a poll up for you at the moment. I would love to hear your feedback on that. What sort of barriers have stopped you or your colleagues from speaking up about safety concerns? Is it financial incentives and bonuses? Is it pressure from co-work? Is it direction from leadership, like in this Boeing case? Or fear that your job will be put at risk? Seeing some really good results there. And it looks like the unfortunate winners in this poll is direction from leadership and fear that your job would be put at risk. Interesting. I think that really mirrors the Boeing case here. It's getting my, there we go. And so, you know, the key focus here is that when speaking up becomes risky, safety becomes fragile. So I'm sure many of you would be, why is my thing not working? There we go. Many of you would be aware of the Brady report. The Brady report was commissioned to investigate and understand a string of fatalities that were happening in the Queensland mining sector. And interestingly, that Boeing case mirrors the exact issues that they identified within this Brady report. So it's things like, you know, supervision is lacking or ineffective. Workers weren't adequately trained for the tasks they're performing. Hazards are unaddressed or normalised or swept under the rug, and that there is a repeating pattern of preventable failures. So we can see that this is exactly what was going on in Boeing, and we know that these are the sorts of issues that have been tied to the cause of the fatalities that we see in mining. And, you know, I'd hazard a guess that this is quite common. We could take these same indicators and apply them in any high risk area. And so here's the thing, we often feel reassured by the presence of our safety systems, protocols, processes, but without human input, testing, challenging, and iterating, those systems can become dangerously disconnected from reality. And we see this all the time, right? Controls exist on paper, but no one's reporting that they're not working. Hazards are formally managed, but frontline workers know that they're really not being managed well. So, you know, I'd hazard a guess that at Boeing, they probably have a really robust critical control management system. They have quality control checks. But the thing is, whenever humans interact with that system, we can bypass those controls, can't we? We can turn a blind eye. We can overstep them when we feel pressured to just, we need to meet these deadlines, we need to win that contract, or heads will roll, right? And so people can bypass these systems. So this is the message I really want to get across, you know, that we tend to feel a lot of trust in our safety systems, but we've got to recognize that if humans are interacting with that system, there must be a culture of psychological safety, or that system is weak and damageable. So Let's then shift into unpacking and understanding the safety experience and exactly what psychological safety is. So, first of all, safety is a whole person experience. When we talk about safety, we often think of hard hats, procedures, and physical controls, but safety really is a whole person experience. And I'm really glad that we've seen the definition of safety change over time. We used to really just be focused on the physical experience of safety and physical safety and risks, but now we actually recognize the social and psychological as well. So just to unpack it a little for you, that physical experience really relates to our physical work environment, the equipment that we use, the high risk tasks that we engage in. It could be shift work. It's the fact that I'm in an underground mine or I'm on the road, seeing customers all day. It's that environmental and physical nature of work. Then there's the social experience of work, which is all to do with the interaction of people in our workplace. So here it's the quality of relationships that we have with our team and our leader. It's communication. It's the felt trust and support. It's my sense of belongingness within the social culture of my organization. And then there's also the psychological experience of work. And that's the psychological experience is my personal feeling of resilience, well-being, engagement, and mental health. And here, of course, a lot of us are thinking about the psychosocial risks and hazards within the workplace. So you can see that working in an environment where it's high pressure, high stakes, or I feel that I have unreasonable expectations on me, these sorts of hazards will impact our psychological experience of the workplace. Now, our narrative at Sentis is that in order to achieve positive safety, we need to be investing in all three of these areas of safety experience. And we want to do that so that people can have safe brains. What we mean is we want people to feel safe, well, and engaged in the workplace. Safe means they feel physically and socially protected, respected, valued, certain of my role and expectations, able to trust and be trusted, and that sense of belongingness and acceptance. Well means I feel competent and confident. I'm calm and grounded. I, believe that I have the capacity to meet the physical, mental, and emotional demands of my role. And engaged means I'm connected to the meaningfulness of my work. I'm connected to the people and the purpose of our organization. I'm intrinsically motivated and able to contribute and, feel a sense of moving forward and progress. When people have safe, well, and engaged brains, they are switched on, they make good decisions, they collaborate well, they're inventive. Every single thing is better in our organization when people are operating from safe, well, and engaged brains. And so the definition of psychological safety, and we take this from Amy Edmondson, is a psychological safety climate is really a shared belief that it's safe to take interpersonal risks in the workplace. And interpersonal risks are things like sharing ideas, asking questions, saying, I can't remember how to do this. It's admitting mistakes. It's doing all of these things that could be socially risky, but having confidence that I'm not going to be reprimanded or there won't be negative repercussions when I do that. And so we say that psychological safety really sits at the intersection of that psychological and social experience of work. And we've been collecting data for many years from a vast array of clients. So based on our safety climate data from over 8,000 respondents across 16 organisations, 5 industries, we tend to see that people are fairly willing to ask each other for help. So that aspect of psychological safety is there. But the opportunity, or where it sort of falls down a little bit, is that people have a bit of a fear of trying new ways of doing things, or they have a perception that mistakes will be managed unfairly. And I think that that mirrors the Boeing case pretty well, because it seems like there was a lot of banter between people on the ground about what was not being done well. They were talking to each other about these things, supporting each other, but there was an unwillingness to push their concerns up the chain. So we tend to see that often in psychological safety, the within teams psychological safety can be quite strong and high. But as soon as we look between teams, as soon as you're going up layers of leadership or across to different teams outside of your own team, that's where it can fall down. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this discussion. Should psychological safety be viewed like a control? And I haven't said as a control, I've said like a control. We've got a great little comment there for you in the chat. What attitudes and opinions do you have about this? So, broadening our view of risk mitigation. So critical control, the definition, are those controls that are essential to prevent or mitigate an unwanted event. So our traditional controls tend to be things like engineering, isolation, procedural mechanisms, etc. And so, and this is because really critical controls come from when we were predominantly focused on physical safety, okay? So they are very, very important. They need to be in place, and we want to keep that going, obviously. We also need to recognize that those traditional critical controls require maintenance and verification, and they work best when they're supported by worker engagement and insight. So the people interacting in these systems and utilizing these critical controls, they need to actually be using them correctly, they're checking them, all of that sort of thing. Now, psychological safety is a human risk mitigating factor. So it enables early identification of issues, but the way that it works is it's a relational and behavioral and cultural in nature. So psychological safety creates the climate where issues can be raised as they occur, and they prevent escalation by surfacing weak signals. Here's the real kicker for me. Psychological safety strengthens the effectiveness of other controls, but it also requires leadership to consistently model and build psychological safety. Yeah, that's a really good point, Lillian. I can see your comment in the chat. It's seen as subjective, so it's easily dismissed. You're absolutely right. And I think there can be a bit of contention and a bit of fiery discussion around whether we should even look at psychological safety as, like a critical control. But here's the thing, it provides an extra layer of defense. So I want you to imagine, think about your critical control management system that you currently have in your organization. Think about that critical control management operating within a culture that is completely devoid of psychological safety. So there's a culture of fear, there's a culture of mistrust in the organization. How well do your critical controls work now? Because this is what we tend to see. Hazards are more likely to go unreported. In fact, we know that fear drives 38% of underreporting. We know how dangerous underreporting is. We sometimes there's little hazards, there's errors, there's near misses. If we don't find out about this, then that's when things escalate to fatalities. That's exactly what the Brady report found. People are more likely to be using workarounds when they can't speak up, and the problem is that the supervisors and managers, they won't be seeing these workarounds. People aren't speaking up about what they're having to do to get the job done. Controls can degrade and become less fit for purpose over time. Workers hesitate to challenge decisions or raise concerns. That's the biggest one, and early warning signs are missed. And so think of the same critical control management system you have in your workplace operating within a culture with really high psychological safety, where people do have those robust relationships where they can challenge each other, they can speak up, they can admit fault without any fear that their job's going to be on the line. How does your critical control management work then? Well, we see weak signals are surfaced. People are able to follow their gut. They're able to say, do you know what? There's something not right about this, and put the tools down, stop the job, and investigate. People speak up when controls aren't working. Risks are discussed and addressed before they escalate. Teams are more likely to be able to adapt and respond proactively. And people report the mistakes, and teams are able to learn from them. This is exactly what we need so that you can have some faith and trust in your critical control management system. I love that comment from our Sentis team there. Very good. So how then, if we do recognize that absolutely we need to take psychological safety seriously, what do we need to do? How do we make it tangible? Because just as Lillian said, because it is subjective, it's easy to dismiss it, right? So this is what we can do. First of all, we can ask. So we can use validated tools to identify how our psychological safety is going in our organization. Now, we have things like our safety climate survey and our safety culture OSEs, our on-site diagnostics, where we actually speak to people in the organization. These are very robust diagnostics that we have to be able to understand where the psychological safety is at. But you can also be asking the people. Actually ask people on a regular basis about their confidence to speak up. Do they perceive that there is fairness in the error management system and the way that errors are dealt with? And we can track that over time. Then we can observe your people. In fact, ask yourself these questions, and I'd love to see it in the chat if you can. Do your people raise concerns regularly? Do they admit mistakes without fear? Do they regularly offer new ideas or challenge the status quo and the way things are currently being done? Do they report issues early? Because these are the telltale signs of high psychological safety. If we're not seeing those things, or if you notice a change, a drop-off in these sorts of behaviors over time, then that can be an early warning sign. These are the sorts of lead indicators of psychological safety. And then there's focusing on leadership. Encourage your leaders to demonstrate the attitudes and behaviors that drive psychological safety. So it's things like this. And think about your own organization, maybe pop it in the chat. Do your leaders do things like this? Recognize and reward reporting and speaking up. I've worked in I've spoken to so many people across the country that have a culture. Well, basically, they're asked. They have a procedure around stopping the job. They're actively told if there is anything concerning or worrying, you have the right to stop the job. So that it's dealt with and everything is safe. I've had so many people say to me, "Oh yeah, we have that policy, but nobody's going to be stopping the job," because the messaging from leaders is that we need to meet KPIs, we must make production, etc. And so leaders actually have to be recognizing and rewarding when people do speak up and stop the job or follow their gut intuition that something is not right. Leaders need to be inviting and acting on feedback. Another little story, I worked in a place where they had a suggestion box, and they encouraged their workers, if they could see a better way to do things or a way to tighten up their systems, to write it in a suggestion and put it in the box. And this person I was speaking to said, "It's a joke, right? I don't reckon anyone's even opened that box." And there's no follow-up, there's no feedback around, "Oh, we've seen this suggestion come through, this is what we're going to," none of that. And so people just disengage, right? So from your leaders, there needs to be a supportive coaching style versus blame. when people do admit fault or they've had a near miss or something, do they get a face ripping, or is there a supportive coaching and learning sort of response, learning a focused response from leaders? So leadership needs to be creating a space for learning.
Hey V, we have a question from Nicole. Nicole, I'm just going to allow you to put your mic on.
Awesome. Hi, Nicole. I can see you're still on mute there. Maybe Nicole doesn't want to speak in the webinar. Could you give me that question, Jazz?
Don't have the question in chat.
All right, I'll just
I'll message you behind the scenes, Nicole.
I've lost my little, there we go. Yes, okay, we'll jump back into that if we can. Happy for me to keep going, Jazz?
Yep.
Beautiful. I love the live experience. There we go. So, and the Brady report recommended that we actually look at the HROs, the high reliability organizations, and what they're doing. There's a lot of industries like health, aviation, the military. These are highly complex organizations and high risk organizations. And so we've learned what they do that has created such good safety outcomes for them. And so we've formed the HRO principles. The Brady report recommends that we follow these principles. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to just recap some of these 5 principles, and we're going to look at how psychological safety enables each and every one of these principles. So the first HRO principle is a preoccupation with failure. So what that means is we have to constantly recognize that despite our best efforts and robust safety systems and procedures, the next failure is potentially always just around the corner. So we can never feel safe that we've got it. Safety is not set and forget. You can't just put these systems in place and go, well, that's it, no more incidents for us. We know that things are unpredictable, things are changeable. There's unexpected elements in the workplace, right? And so failure, we have to be constantly preoccupied with failure. And that's something that high reliability organizations really understand and get. And so how does psychological safety enable that? Well, it creates an environment where people feel safe to speak up about the weak signals, those near misses, those abnormalities, like I said, the gut feeling that something's not quite right here. And so it's psychological safety that enables us to look for those things that might be a sign of potential failure and to speak up about them. The next one here is a reluctance to simplify. And that means that complex problems get complex solutions. I think sometimes we try to make everything far too simple, or, in the past, when incidents have been investigated, we just drill down to human factors, right? The human was at fault, they made a wrong decision. But I think we really need to step back and ask ourselves, well, but why? And understand the cultural dynamics and the systemic issues around that person that might have influenced the decisions we make in the moment. Cool. And so, how does psychological safety enable that? Well, it encourages people to share their diverse views, to challenge assumptions, and to speak up when things aren't straightforward or when the usual explanation doesn't feel right. So psychological safety is really important so that people can, it's the old "there's no stupid questions" thing. Often people don't want to put forward their thoughts or their ideas or their questions because they're worried they're going to be shut down or look like an idiot or, that sort of thing. And so it requires a lot of psychological safety in order to meet this principle. Then there's a sensitivity to operations. And that means that every voice matters. HROs stay connected to the reality of frontline work. They monitor day-to-day operations and encourage real-time feedback. from the closest to the work. And we've seen lots of industries and organizations that do this well. You might remember the Toyota story and how, they would listen to the people, actually building the cars on the conveyor belts and things like that. They listen to the people closest to the work and get their feedback. So psychological safety is important here. If you want to hear from frontline workers, they can be the most disempowered people in the organization, right? As opposed to these high level leaders. And so it requires a lot of psychological safety for them to speak openly about the risks, workarounds, or concerns, misalignments between procedure and reality, confidently, without fear of a judgment or blame. Number 4 is a commitment to resilience. So this means that high reliability organizations, they want to recover swiftly. When there is an incident or a failure, they don't waste time blaming and shaming and getting all bogged down in who did what and finger pointing and things like this. They want to quickly learn and get back into, production. They want to make it better and then get back on the tools and continue. So they recover quickly when unexpected events occur. So psychological safety enables that because it fosters open debriefs, honest discussion about failure, and a mindset where people can admit errors and learn from them. There's often that practice of learning teams. Learning teams is aiming to meet exactly this principle, right? So a learning team is getting all your people together and understanding. It's that difference between the job is planned and the job is done. So the people out there on the front line, they're the ones doing the tasks. Often it might be that the job is as planned, as ideal, went like X, Y, and Z, but when they get out there, the situation is different. Maybe they don't have the right tools. Maybe there's other things going on, which is preventing them from being able to operate to that ideal state. And so if your learning team is going to be worthwhile doing at all, there needs to be psychological safety. No point running learning teams if you have a psychological safety climate that is poor, because people will not speak up. They're not going to be honest. They're not going to challenge. They're not going to talk back, right? Because it's not safe to do that. So before you go running your learning teams, which is an awesome initiative, by the way, it's got to be run within a culture of high psychological safety. And then number 5 is a deference to expertise. So this means that the experts are trusted. High reliability organizations empower the people with the most relevant knowledge to make decisions, regardless of the hierarchy or rank. And again, psychological safety, really just means that ensures everyone from the newest apprentice to the most experienced operator feels safe to contribute their knowledge, raise concerns, and all of that. I really saw this in the book that you can probably see behind me, Leading Positive Safety. We interviewed the wonderful Robin Heap from Lawson Grains, and she told me a story that we have in the book, which really illustrates that. She said that, a way that we can, a great indicator for us that our culture is strong and positive and it's working, is when we see the new guy, the new, farmhand, the new apprentice, whatever, who is speaking up about things that aren't working. They're logging maintenance issues, or they're speaking up about near misses and reporting hazards. She said, when that person, the new bloke in the team, the youngest person in the team, when they actually speak up about things, we know that our psychological safety is good. So again, that's something you consider. You can consider for yourselves. Are you seeing that happen within your own organizations? Loving to see the chats going off in there. So we come back to this question here, and I would love to have a bit of dialogue in the chat. This is the question I posed at the very beginning here. If we treated psychological safety as seriously as any other critical control, what do you think would be different? what would we see the differences are in how we lead, in how we manage risk, and how we respond to warning signs? So I want to give you a little bit of time here. And if anyone does want to pop in and speak about your reflections on this, I'd love that. But yeah, particularly in the chat, if we did treat psychological safety that importantly, that it's the same importance as a critical control, what would we see different? That's different. Oh, didn't know that would do that. All right. I'll move on and we can come back to that. We've still got a little bit of time actually, so we can have a bit of a discussion or questions at the end. The point here is that without trust, voice, and openness, high reliability remains theoretical. There's a lot of focus, these days on HRO, these principles, which I think is fantastic. We need to be aiming and striving for those. I wonder though how do we get those in action if we don't have a focus on psychological safety? It's a really good point there that high reliability is merely theoretical unless we have that foundation of high psychological safety. So to wrap up this discussion, here are 5 takeaways that can help you to build high psychological safety. And perhaps you can, as I go through this list, you might actually tell me in the chat which 1 or 2 of these might you feel you need to focus on in your organization. So first of all, we need to demonstrate that safety comes before speed or before production, before our production KPIs or whatever it might be. We need to listen to the early warning signs. We need to be rewarding those people who speak up. We need to train leaders to respond supportively. That's a really big kicker. And we need to make psychological safety visible. Lillian says number 4 and 5 there. So does Sheridan. Yep. Awesome. Yeah, on that first point, demonstrating that safety comes before speed. Every organization says, we value safety over production. We all have this narrative, right? The question is, what are we actually doing that proves that point? Jazz, were you about to say something?
No, sorry.
Oh, thought I heard something. All right, so we're going to open up to some questions in just a moment. Oh, I've got a good question there. I'll come to yours in a sec, Margot. So just a couple of call outs. I love this line that psychosocial safety isn't optional anymore. We've all seen the changes in the regulations. We know that we need to have a real focus and a plan of attack and action on psychosocial safety. I've found that lots of organizations, lots of leaders are still a little bit messy head around how do we work towards improving our psychosocial safety, what is involved in that. This masterclass is a real must-have for organizations. So this equips your leaders to understand psychosocial safety. We've been talking about psychological safety, which is that feeling of safety, social safety. That is part of the wider psychosocial safety. So this 4-week masterclass is a blended learning approach where you will be able to access online learning in little chunks, in 4 little chunks. You can keep that information. It's full of great tools and resources and real-world application. And then we come together in weekly, basically like co-coaching groups where we dive into discussion around the topics. We talk about, well, how do we get this going in your workplace? How do we tailor it to your needs? For our past participants, they've said that actually these discussions with the cohort have been the most valuable part of this program. So I will be running one of these at the start of September. There's a link in the chat at the moment. If you're interested in that, we have a little promo on that. Spaces are very limited, so we have a maximum of 20 people in that. They will be snapped up soon, so I would encourage you to come along if you're interested in equipping yourself and your leaders with some tools around psychosocial safety. You also get AIHS CPD points as well for that, 8 points for that. And then there is coaching with confidence. Coaching is such a great skill. It's an important skill that every single leader, and not even just leaders, all of us, right? Parents, you might coach your local netball team, whatever. We all need great coaching skills. And our leaders' communication is so tied to the psychological safety within an organization. I just ran one of these sessions earlier this week with a great organization, one of our clients in the agricultural field. And we had such a hoot and great conversations through that. And they're walking away with a lot of great skills. So again, we have a promo link there in the chat. Please do jump on that. We have another one of those coming at the end of August, and we've already got space starting to fill up. 3 CPD points for that one. And I'm going to stop my share in a moment, but please do reach out if you want to take some of these discussions offline and have a bit of a chat about these sorts of issues around psychological safety. I'd love to hear it. You can reach me on my email there, drop me a line or message me through LinkedIn. Okay, I'll stop my share now. There we go. And let's go to some questions.
So, Vanessa, I was wondering, Craig has put in the following question. Given that individuals respond differently to the same situations due to factors like personality, experience, stress levels, and cultural background, how can organizations ensure the consistent application of human-centric controls?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And you're absolutely right. Our felt experience.
Oh, sorry, that was actually from Jovan.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. The felt experience of the workplace is going to be different for each individual person. And I think that's one reason that psychosocial safety feels so kind of tricky, because we can't just make assumptions. I mean, physical risks are a bit easier, right? Because if someone falls off a rooftop, 100% can guarantee that person's going to be injured. And in fact, anyone that falls off a rooftop, you can say is going to be, have some injuries. The psychosocial safety area is more tricky because depending on those personal factors, my personal resources, my experience, past experience, whether or not I have support from leaders, whether I feel connected to my team, psychosocial hazards will be different in the eye of the beholder, or, the felt experience is different. Psychological safety is exactly the same. So this is why we actually need to be asking people about their personal feeling of psychological safety. Do they feel they can speak up? Do they feel they can admit errors without negative repercussions? And so this is why, safety climate surveys and things like our OSCs, our on-site investigations are so important, so that we can actually be hearing from the people and you can understand, what are the stories that people tell themselves around this organization. I've even worked in a place where there was a high up, I think it was a general manager or something, a GM of this mine site that had been there years before, had a very negative impact. He was he seemed to just tear shreds through the culture. He came in and it was just a terrible impact on everyone, caused a lot of mistrust. But he had been gone for like 7 or 8 years. But the legacy of the damage that he did was still felt. In culture, it can be like scar tissue, right? It takes a long time to get over that. And even though it wasn't the way they dealt with things now, people believed that if you do one thing wrong, if you're found to have been involved in a near miss, you get a window seat. That means you're kicked off the bus, right? Yeah, you're going to lose your job. Now, that wasn't the case, and the leaders assured me that no one is treated like that. However, that was people's belief, right? So, because of things that had happened in the past. So, even though this is why we do need to actually ask people about psychological safety. We ask individuals, be asking your teams if you're a leader. Start these discussions. Encourage people to speak up about their experience and their expectations and beliefs around that. I hope that helps answer that question.
Another question in the chat from Margot is psychological safety touches all areas of work. Should it be separated out as a separate control, or should it be part of how we do business?
Really good one, Margot. Look, I probably would say I'm probably not the best person to answer that in terms of whether we take it on or try to see it like a critical control, etc. However, I will go so far to say, as I'm extremely passionate about the fact that psychological safety is just one of the most important things that you need to consider and have in place for everything else to work effectively. And I'll go on that hill and I'll die on it, right? Because none of our safety systems work effectively or can be trusted without psychological safety. So I would say that it needs to be in every single thing. I actually read an article, I could find it if you're interested, but this article, someone was talking about the fact that often we see psychological safety as the icing on the cake. So that kind of indicates that it's a bit of a nice to have. It's something that just finishes it off and is an additive in the last moment. But this article is saying absolutely not. We can't see it like that. It's a fundamental, foundational aspect of good safety systems. So yes, Margot, I would say that we need to look at psychological safety in every area that we can. And really, thinking about it first and foremost. I really push back and rail against the idea that psychological safety is fluffy and, in the land of rainbows and unicorns. It's not. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think what Nikki Blair said is actually really cool. It's the base of the cake, not just
Yes.
the icing.
It's the flower, right?
And Lillian said that she would like to see it more normalized too. Now, Natalie asked a question. It's sort of in the same vein. She said that psychological safety is another concept on top of HRO, safety 1 and 2, HOP, etc. How do we get back to focusing on looking after your people and using everyday language rather than it being a compliance, profitability, different safety concepts or a campaign that we're running?
Ooh, that's such a great meaty question. And we could probably even do a whole webinar on that one. So so many organizations, we are getting focused on these safety philosophies like HOP and HRO and all these sorts of things, and they're awesome, right? But I think that what we're seeing is there can be a disconnect between the philosophy and the narrative of those things, and actually what are the attitudes and behaviors that drive those things? Essentially, my belief is everything boils down to leadership. If your leadership is, if they are able to create good rapport, create a sense of psychological safety, be connected with their people, create a really good social experience of work, that is how we actually start to be able to achieve those principles and those safety philosophies. And, this shouldn't just be owned. I think sometimes psychosocial safety and psychological safety as well tend to end up the remit of the HR crews, right? So they're sort of over there, whereas traditional safety is always done is the remit of, the safety teams and the teams doing the physical work, which I think is sort of incorrect, because we all need to be focused on the psychological safety, the sort of openness and robustness of our culture within the organizations, and we all need to be considering not just the physical but the social and psychological experience of work. So it shouldn't be that one team is doing this and the other team's doing that. It needs to be everybody's business, and every single leader contributes to that culture of safety.
And that's all the questions that we've got for the time being.
Wonderful, fantastic. Look, we're right at time, so I will scan my eye. If you want to get in touch, please do. Love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope this has been useful, and let's keep the conversation going. I'll see you in a webinar real soon. Thank you.